Imagine this. You're walking through the marble heart of ancient Rome. Statues gleam under the midday sun. Senators argue beneath archways. Perfumed courtesans whisper behind golden fans. Then the air shifts. The crowd parts. The emperor is coming. Nero, the artist emperor. The man who burned Rome and sang while it crumbled, if you believe the stories. Draped in purple silk, head held high, flanked by guards and sycophants. But today, something's different. At his side walks someone who doesn't quite belong. A figure so elegant, so polished, so eerily composed that every eye locks on them. Draped in imperial finery, jewels at the throat, makeup flawlessly applied, graceful, silent, gliding like a dream. Rome murmurs. A new empress. No, not quite. Because under the layers of silk powder and expectation stands a boy. This isn't just a bizarre footnote in Roman history. This is the story of Sporus, a palace slave who was plucked from obscurity and transformed physically, publicly, irreversibly into the ghost of a dead woman. Not out of love, but out of grief, obsession, power. Over the next few minutes, we're going to pull back the layers on one of the most disturbing stories ever whispered in the corridors of empire. A story not just about who Sporus was, but what he was made to become, and why, for one of the most feared emperors in Roman history, that transformation may have been the most dangerous act of all. Before he became a tyrant, Nero was a dream. When he took the throne at just 16, the Roman elite breathed a cautious sigh of relief. Here was a boy raised in the arts, tutored by the philosopher Seneca, taught to value beauty, poetry, and mercy. For a brief moment, it seemed that Rome might enter a golden age of refinement rather than war. He lowered taxes, funded public games, wrote music. He even took the stage himself, scandalizing the old guard, yes, but thrilling the masses. Nero wanted to be more than a ruler. He wanted to be adored, applauded, immortalized not in bronze, but in verse. But Rome isn't kind to dreamers with too much power. As his reign stretched on, Nero began to suffocate under the weight of expectation. Every slight felt like betrayal. Every rival seemed like a conspiracy. His need to be loved twisted into something darker, a hunger to control not just Rome, but reality itself. And slowly, one by one, the voices that once guided him were silenced. His mother, his wife, his advisors, dead, exiled, forgotten. And in the void, a single figure rose to dominate Nero's heart and mind. Poppaea Sabina, beautiful, calculating, deadly in her charm. She didn't just steal the emperor's attention. She became the sun around which his entire world revolved. And when she was gone, Nero didn't just mourn her. He refused to let her go. And that is where Sporus's story begins. Not with love, but with a death so devastating it demanded a replacement. One the emperor would make with his own hands. Poppaea Sabina didn't just walk into Nero's life, she conquered it. She was everything his first wife Octavia wasn't. Octavia was noble, dutiful, politically ideal, but she was cold, reserved, and worst of all, unimpressed by Nero's theatrics. Their marriage was a political arrangement, a remnant of his predecessor Claudius's vision for a stable succession. But Poppaea, she was fire. A former wife of a general, Poppaea knew how to navigate power. She had the looks of a goddess and the mind of a strategist. Ancient historians called her manipulative, ambitious, dangerous. But in Nero's eyes, she was perfection. He worshipped her, showered her with gifts from every province of the empire, pearls from the Red Sea, silks from the East, perfumes carried in golden jars. He commissioned statues in her likeness. Coins were struck with her face. She was no longer just his lover. She was Rome's unofficial empress long before the crown was hers. But Nero's love was suffocating. He demanded her attention like a child, yet watched her every move like a tyrant. Jealousy stalked his mind. He wanted to possess her completely, irrevocably. And Poppaea, she was no pawn. She challenged him, mocked him, whispered criticisms he couldn't bear from anyone else. Their arguments were frequent, vicious, volatile. And one night in 65 AD, it ended the only way such a match ever could, violently. A blow, a fall, a final breath. Poppaea was dead. And with her, so was Nero's last tether to reality. No one knows exactly what Nero was thinking when he struck Poppaea. Maybe it was impulse. Maybe it was rage. Maybe in his delusional world he thought she would survive. But what happened next was not remorse. It was madness. The Empire expected a funeral, a pyre, public mourning. Instead, Nero refused to cremate her, an unthinkable rejection of Roman custom. He embalmed her like an Egyptian queen, sealing her in a tomb built not for grief, but for worship. He ordered statues carved in her honor, draped in fresh garlands each morning. Her perfume was kept burning in the imperial quarters. At banquets, her seat remained untouched, gilded and empty like a ghost, daring the living to forget. And Nero, he didn't just grieve her. He recreated her. He spoke to her as if she were still alive, issued decrees in her name, demanded that courtiers toast to her memory as if her spirit hovered in the candlelit halls. In his mind, Poppaea hadn't died. She'd only slipped behind a curtain, waiting for the right cue to return. But gods don't answer when mortals beg, and Poppaea was gone. So Nero found a substitute, a boy in the palace, barely a teenager, slender, beautiful, with eyes that caught the light in exactly the same way. His name was Sporus, and soon he wouldn't just be a shadow of the woman Nero lost, he would be forced to become her. Sporus was nobody until he was everything. A young palace slave, likely no older than 13 or 14, born into the margins of the empire, literate, quiet, intelligent, groomed perhaps for minor court duties or bookkeeping. He might have hoped for a comfortable, invisible life tucked between columns and scrolls. But Sporus had one fatal feature: a face that looked uncannily like the dead Empress. Ancient sources fixate on it: his eyes, his cheekbones, the delicate structure of his jaw. Nero noticed. And in that fractured, grief-drenched mind, something twisted. What if she wasn't gone? What if I could bring her back? What followed wasn't affection. It was transformation by decree. Nero summoned his physicians, not for healing, but for alteration. Sporus was forcibly castrated, mutilated, not to save his life, but to erase it, to make room for another's. This wasn't gender identity. This wasn't choice. It was performance. It was empire. Sporus's recovery was likely brutal. No anesthesia, no understanding, only orders. And once his body was reshaped, the real rehearsal began. Silks were tailored to hide what no longer existed. Hair was curled into courtly styles. Makeup was applied with surgical precision. Speech coaches drilled his voice until it softened, lost its edge. Etiquette masters taught him to glide, bow, pour, whine, and smile on cue. And all the while Nero watched, hungry, hopeful, desperate. He renamed him Sabina, Poppaea's name. And Sabina, as Sporus was now called, was no longer permitted to exist as himself. His history, his voice, his body, rewritten to fit a fantasy. He had become not a person, but a mirror, reflecting back a grief-soaked emperor's broken dreams. And the final act in this theater of delusion, a wedding, because Nero wasn't finished, not until the entire empire believed the lie. Rome had seen its share of strange spectacles, but nothing prepared the empire for the day its emperor married a boy dressed as his dead wife. The ceremony was imperial in scale, lavish, loud, dripping with excess. Guests arrived in silk and gold. Priests performed the rites with solemnity. The crowd, full of senators and social climbers, offered toasts and applause with fixed smiles and knotted stomachs, because everyone knew. They knew that the bride, veiled in translucent fabric and weighed down with sapphires, was not a woman. They knew this wasn't romance. It was theater, state-sponsored delusion, a one-man tragedy with a forced co-star. But no one dared speak, not in Nero's Rome. Sporus now. Sabina stood at Nero's side, silent and motionless like a marionette carved in ivory. He played the role. He curtsied, accepted the ring, received the imperial kiss. His eyes stayed wide, his mouth closed. And from that day forward, the performance never stopped. At banquets, he sat beside Nero, posed and polished. In parades, he was paraded through the streets, smiling with imperial grace. In private, he endured the emperor's affection, the touch, the gaze, the expectations. It wasn't love. It wasn't even cruelty in the traditional sense. It was possession, ritual, a desperate attempt to make death yield, and Sporus. He became a ghost in his own body, watching as the empire clapped for a lie it didn't believe. Every gesture was rehearsed, every word measured. One mistake, one wrong look, and he might disappear. He wasn't just Nero's Empress. He was his obsession, sculpted from grief and propped up like a monument to madness. And Rome kept applauding. Empires don't die quietly, and neither did Nero. By 68 AD, Rome had had enough. The Senate turned. The Praetorian Guard, once Nero's private army, abandoned him. Uprisings spread across the provinces. The city whispered rebellion. For the first time, Nero found himself without applause. He fled the palace not in a golden chariot, but in shame and panic, with a few loyal companions clinging to the wreckage of his reign. Among them was Sporus. The boy who had once stood beside him in triumph now followed him into exile, still cloaked in silk, still bearing the name of a woman long dead. They hid in a villa outside the city. Rome was closing in. Nero, cornered, broken, trembling, prepared for suicide. He begged one of his freedmen to help him die, lacking even the courage to take the final step himself. Sporus stayed by his side. What did he feel in those final moments? Relief, confusion, grief, for a man who had destroyed him, yet also given him purpose. However twisted, when Nero pressed a dagger to his throat and fell, the empire turned a page. But Sporus, he didn't vanish. He remained a living relic of the emperor's madness. Not a consort, not a slave, not even a person in the eyes of the court. Just an echo, a beautifully dressed phantom. And now, without Nero's shadow to define him, Sporus would have to survive in a world that only saw him as a symbol of someone else's downfall. With Nero gone, Rome entered chaos. The empire cycled through a carousel of short-lived emperors, each one clawing for legitimacy in a crumbling world. And in the middle of it all stood Sporus, no longer a consort, no longer protected, but still unmistakably recognizable. To some, he was a curiosity. To others, a punchline. To the powerful, he was a possession. He was passed from patron to patron, not out of affection, but spectacle. One general kept him as a pet symbol of imperial decadence. Another used him as a prop in court gossip. People would invite Sporus to dinner not for conversation, but for silent entertainment. The worst came with Emperor Vitellius. Vitellius, vulgar and brutal, conceived a public performance so obscene it barely seems real. He wanted Sporus to be paraded into the arena during a festival, forced to reenact the myth of Proserpina, the goddess abducted and violated by Pluto. Except in this version, Sporus wouldn't be acting. It was no longer enough that his body had been taken. They wanted to take his dignity, publicly, fatally. Facing the horror ahead, Sporus made the only decision he ever truly owned. He chose to die. Poison, most likely, quick, quiet, off stage. Not for glory, not for vengeance, but for freedom. He was likely no older than 20, and in death he did what he was never allowed to do in life. He ended the story on his own terms. There was no eulogy for Sporus, no statue, no coins, no mourning in the streets. History barely whispered his name. But in that final act, choosing death over spectacle, Sporus claimed the one thing Nero and Rome had denied him again and again: agency. For years, his body had been molded, his voice rehearsed, his smile choreographed. He was never asked who he wanted to be, never allowed to choose the clothes he wore, the name he answered to, or even the face he saw in the mirror. His existence was a script written by others, performed for an audience that never clapped for him, only for the ghost he was forced to become. So when the arena loomed, when the emperor of the day plotted to make a farce of his life and his suffering, Sporus said no, quietly, decisively. He chose poison over pageantry, silence over screams, oblivion over one final humiliation. And maybe, just maybe, in that fleeting moment before the world dimmed, he felt something close to peace. Not as Sabina, not as a symbol, as Sporus, the boy who had been forgotten, the boy who had never really been allowed to live, the boy who in death took back his name. Sporus is often remembered, when remembered at all, as a footnote to Nero's madness, a curiosity, a grotesque artifact of imperial excess. But strip away the marble columns, the silk gowns, and the imperial delusions, and what remains is a human being. A child who was never given a choice, whose body became a battleground for grief, obsession, and political theater, whose identity was overwritten, repackaged, and paraded, whose silence was mistaken for consent, and whose story was twisted to fit the needs of everyone but himself. In a modern world that still struggles with questions of bodily autonomy, gender identity, and the scars left by unchecked power, Sporus's story rings out louder than ever. This was not a tale of love. It was a tale of control disguised as devotion, of pain dressed in pearls, of how an emperor with infinite power tried to resurrect a woman by erasing a boy. And yet even in the darkest chapters of that story there was resistance. Not loud, not revolutionary, but real. In choosing death over performance, Sporus made the only statement he could. I am not your puppet. I am not your empress. I am not your memory. And for one breath, one moment, that truth was his alone. History may have tried to forget Sporus,